Some might say there are topics that fall into the category of biblical but not Christ-like, such as incest, blasphemy and genocide. Just because it's biblical doesn't mean it's endorsed by God, and can be considered a mere fact of history, similar to the Holocaust in German history, something important to remember but not to be followed. However, slavery is a difficult topic to categorise, due to many passages speaking of slavery in a seemingly positive light, not to mention it's used in justifying the slave trade by Christian nations back in the day of the high slave trade. This is a sticking point with many biblical naysayers, who use this as a firm grounding for their arguments, especially when it comes to morality. And yet it's worthwhile noting many of the slave abolitionists throughout history were indeed Christians. Such notable figures as Abraham Lincoln, Nelson Mandela played a part in the abolition of the slave trade and ownership of slaves in their countries. And let us not forget Dr. Martin Luther King, who was one of the leading figures ensuring the rights of African Americans were respected by the predominantly white populace. Are these great paragons of human rights going against their professed Christian faith? Or are they being Christ-like and reminding people of the parts of the Bible that have been forgotten through centuries of tradition and bigotry? This, along with other questions, I hope to answer as I seek the true Christian perspective on slavery as stated in the Bible. The best place to start is actually the start of slavery itself. It is one of the oldest institutes in human history, some scholars saying it goes all the way back to the Neolithic period and was commonplace in Mesopotamia, Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa, long before the so-called enlightened nations of the West took over that area and crossed the seas. How it started is undocumented, but it's not hard to understand how it came about. The best way I can demonstrate it is with a thought experiment that delves into other aspects of human behaviour that will become apparent. To make it simpler, we'll start in the home. Let's assume a simple, homely lifestyle. I don't think it will matter if it's a single lifestyle, a couple or a family, so we're going to leave that open to interpretation or open to conjecture. It's entirely up to you. Let us think about our own home lives and all the jobs we have to do around the house. Some of them, like cooking, we enjoy. But of course there are going to be jobs that we don't enjoy and would rather not do if at all possible. Kind of examples are washing up, loading and unloading the dishwasher, dusting, hoovering, taking the bins out, and many more besides. Essentially, if your teenager moans about doing it, it's something that is not pleasant to do, but still has to be done. It's important for discipline for them to learn those things. And all these things are necessary to maintain the lifestyle that we enjoy. Yes, there are some people that refuse to do either of those, but that will lead to things going downhill very quickly, which means the homely life is not pleasant. And certainly not as what we want it to be. As I said, teenagers will be slobs. There could be a scenario where we will always do the right thing and get those jobs done. However, that requires 100% consistency. Something for which humans are not that well known for. If anything, we're known for making colossal mistakes, which can lead to unpleasant results. Of course, there is a solution to this. Give the job to someone else to do, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. With that job no longer a problem, your life is a bit better. Whether that's how servants arose in a society is a matter of debate, with some people having the menial jobs to do like the cleaning out of the latrines, the washing of the pots, and so forth. It goes on to the point that those who didn't want to do those jobs have everything seemingly perfect. They're doing things that they want to do rather than things that they don't want to do, but it's still keeping them comfortable. Yes, it means someone else has to do those jobs, but since your life is much better now, well, that's not really much of a problem. In all the home structures mentioned above, this would be fairly harmonious, and one would hope a grateful one. However, humans, as I said, are not known for perfection, and this is something we can't have. The moment you start to grow a family and generations pass, the dynamic changes. From the grateful one being thankful and rewarding to 2, whom we will call X, number 2, whom we will call B in this case, would not see the inconvenience of those jobs they never had to do. And whilst they might spare X a glance and understand the jobs needed doing and could see the benefit of having them do it, they won't understand why. When 4 or C comes along, they might start viewing X in the same way they view the jobs, dirty and not worthy of note. In short, it can easily take just 3 generations to turn a productive partnership into an entitlement-based hierarchy. A way of looking at it is similar to what I refer to as the IT gratuity gap. Essentially, if the job is something's gone wrong, you start asking, what do we pay them for? It's clearly a job they're not doing. But if something is going perfectly well and you can't see what the problem is, you start wondering why you employed them in the first place. There's a whopping big gap between do you do your job properly or why aren't you doing your job? Why are we paying you? This can start with just that. But the moment you see someone as lesser than you, be it a prisoner of war, a convicted criminal, or someone who owes you a massive debt, or debt to a higher member of society, it can grow and make it very much a hierarchy based on either the fact that you don't see the jobs they do for you, or you think those jobs are beneath you, and so people lower should do them. So that's established why slavery was there in the first place. So what does the Bible have to say? What do many naysayers say the Bible says, more importantly? Well, many passages, including Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, and Deuteronomy 15, seem very heavily leaning towards pro-slavery. Many seem focused on how to treat slaves in a more loving and godly fashion, or so it seems. There are also passages that tell slaves to be more obedient to their masters, no matter how unfair or unjust their treatment of them is. Some translations even use the term perverse, which gives an unpleasantly sexual aspect to the proceedings, which... There's even a verse that gives guidelines on how hard to beat their slaves. So it doesn't seem like a pretty picture. Of course, there are those that will say that this is all in the Old Testament. The laws were fulfilled by Christ upon his crucifixion and resurrection, thus are no longer required to be followed. Unfortunately, that falls into the classic debate about whether Christ fulfilled the laws or whether the laws will be cancelled out upon his return at the end of days. It also forgets about Paul's letters, which mention slavery, including the letter to the Ephesians. So far from being an Old Testament problem, it's very much in the books containing the teachings of Christ himself. Furthermore, it seems Jesus had about as much to say on the topic as he does to any reference of homosexuality. Tangential at best and non-existent at worst. However, let us take a closer look at the Old Testament passages, because depending on your angle, it makes a whole lot of difference. For example, in Exodus 21, it clearly shows that the slaves actually have many rights. Then they're not expected to work for more than 6 years and then allowed to go free. If he comes into the system with a wife, she's to be let go too. Even if the master gives him a wife who may not be released with him, it is self-evident that the man is not expected to keep the wife. In fact, if he's forced into the marriage and chooses not to remain with her, he's allowed to leave her and his children, who will be provided for by the master. Those who say the master may pretend to be kind and gentle until the man chooses to remain with his family, and the master, only to abuse them going forwards, 6 years is a long time to put on such an act. Add that to the fact that others will mention terrible treatment of other slaves, he would be very aware of this situation long before getting any reason to remain beyond his tenure. The part about slaves getting beaten, if they die, the master gets fined. If they survive the first few days, they may be kept. But since the slave is injured, odds are they'll be on lower duties and thus be less productive. Many will say that the slave has to be standing up and clearly able to work, but no, the term ya'amad has been used in several texts, meaning to stand, but also to rise or to remain, thus heavily implying survive, live, be strong. Essentially, he has to be in a position to work, or at the very least, to be alive. In short, there's more chance of lowering productivity in beating slaves than can ever be achieved by beating them. So quite apart from being a bastion of slave ownership and brutality, it's more of a very strict rule book that will annoy anyone who doesn't want to treat them with any respect, as the Lord has asked of them. This is something that is very common in later chapters. Many would point out that Jesus never spoke out against slavery, and that is true. However, another person did. The prophet Jeremiah. He's not that well known amongst the prophets, but he seems to be the one with the most to say on slavery. He reminds the people of Israel in chapter 34 that these slaves are fellow human beings and must be let go at the appointed time. Many people might point out that the book of Jeremiah was only added to the Torah some 200 years after his own time, and so could contain a turn of phrase or sentiment that wouldn't have been held by Jeremiah himself, and so not expressed during his lifetime, thus making his storm of slavery somewhat invalid in that time also. However, the dates around the time Deuteronomy had been written, and therefore the laws likely most likely to be enacted would have been during Jeremiah's lifetime. With many prophets being considered a conduit for God's voice on earth, it could well be that Jeremiah's position on slavery could be a response to the laws being written at that time, thus God suggesting he was not pleased at how the slaves were being treated, despite the laws he gave them in the first place. Does this mean that Jeremiah was being rather woke in his thinking, as we would call it today? I don't think so, since in Exodus 21:16 it specifically highlights those people that kidnap people to sell them as slaves shall be put to death. Sounds alarming, but I somehow don't think any Christian naysayer will have much footing to argue against this, since the alternative is be kind to the slave owner, which sort of destroys their point on slavery in the first place. Just an observation I have there. With this in mind, why did God allow the Israelites to have slaves? Well, this is interesting because if you consider the somewhat better treatment they were likely to get under Israel compared to the other tribes, and that they would have been freed and become members of the tribe of Israel itself after a due amount of time in service, this would be certainly preferable. Many would say that any amount of time as a slave is abhorrent, and they would be right. In fact, many people who work itinerant jobs to get their second-year visa in Australia would say they had to work 88 days essentially as a slave. But given the attitudes of the other tribes towards their own slaves, who were known to do human sacrifices and quite possibly involve them in those sacrifices along with sexual orgies, and that in all likelihood they would consider the immediate freeing of a slave akin to releasing livestock into a village, it is most likely safer to maintain a slave in service until such time as their former owner has forgotten about them, and any marks or symbols of their servitude have been washed away, leaving them a whole new man of the tribe of Israel. Furthermore, slaves were not looked at merely as property, even being treated separately from animals by those people who divided up the chapters of the Bible into referenceable sections. If you look down, I'm pretty sure it was Exodus 21, you will see, in some versions, how to treat slaves, how to deal with violence, and then later, after another section about slaves, how to treat property, and that includes animals. They could also inherit the household if the master dies without an heir, showing they were seen as people with rights. This is something that was notable in the time of Abraham. If he died without a son or heir, his slaves, his servants, would have adopted the house of Abraham, the land that was promised to his children. In short, what's not ideal? Considering the alternative, being under a tribe with strict rules referring to the harming of their slaves and potentially running a household one day, it's not the worst thing ever. It sounds more like being brought into a company, adopted as a son, and then being given the company if the owner has no children to pass the company on to. It may seem very hard at first, but as you rise up, and you become a notable employee, you will in fact soon become the owner of the company with the same responsibilities as your employer. But doesn't that go against the New Testament, which has passages about slaves being submitted to their owners? Fortunately, Bible studies have been made of Paul's letters, specifically to the Ephesians, and all of them suggest that the people back then in the Greek town of Ephesia have fallen back into the old ways under the Roman Empire, including prostitution and the ownership of slaves. Slavery was rife in ancient Rome, and it being the major power in the New Testament Mediterranean area, its morals and practices would have been picked up by other nations to try and appease the might of Rome. Their methods of slavery were far harsher than old Israel as well. So if anything, it was far worse than it was back in Old Testament times. That's why Paul was writing then. The Church of Ephesus was essentially a rebel group fighting against the oppression of Rome and the government pandering to them. They were essentially the Judean People's Front. This would have included slaves among their number. Thus, Paul addresses them. One could say, in that case, he should teach them to rebel. But one has to remember, Paul's a learned man who knew history. And if history teaches us anything, it's that empires rise and then fall. Slaves rising up against their masters are more likely to be killed or crucified. The best thing they can do is wait until the empire weakens before fighting against it for their freedom. His other letters mentioning slavery and their masters are likewise cautionary. It's not to bring down the empire. It's not to force slaves into eternal servitude. It's to wait until the right time. Anyone knows in a war, waiting for the right moment is important. And Paul, a student of history, would have known that. So with all that in mind, with the Old Testament being remarkably stringent on how people should treat slaves, and the New Testament being very much supporting the slaves in their struggles, why did it take Christianity in the modern day so long to start fighting against the slave trade, if it's something that should have been in their religion in the first place? Unfortunately, the general understanding of humankind in regards to the nasty jobs, as mentioned above, and the plain simple fact that the slaves added a trading commodity along with being a source of cheap labour, results in many of the higher echelons of Western society turning a blind eye to the misuse of humans as trading items and labour. This combines the human capacity of taking entitlement and the distaste of someone so-called lower than you, and the good life it allows others to have, especially if it's you, and consider the means just. In short, it's not just a Christian problem. It's an all too human problem. Interestingly enough, there's actually exemplified in Jeremiah, in the same chapter that he told the officials to free all the slaves, which is a direct edict from God. And less than a verse later, they changed their minds and enslaved them again. Humans are not good beings. we cannot have a good thing and keep it. One thing someone raised, which is a very interesting point, is, do the Abrahamic faiths actually want to be free? I can't for the life of me remember what his name was. I can't find the reference, I can't find the video. But his interesting point was that Christians, Jews, and Muslims bow down to a master, that being God, sometimes falling on their faces, and in many cases holding their hands together as they pray, almost as though their hands were in shackles. This so doesn't sound like a religion of freedom, but one of perpetual slavery, which includes even the act of worshipping God puts one in a position of humility to a greater power, especially one who changed you. There's an interesting position to take, but also one I think misses a couple of key points. First of all, being humble isn't a negative thing. In fact, pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, and being humble, especially in the presence of those stronger than you, can be considered the opposite of pride. Is it wrong to show someone respect? Second, we actually have an awful lot to thank God for. The Jews have God to thank for bringing them out of slavery in Egypt and to the Promised Land. Remember that, they were slaves themselves. The Christians, and indeed all of mankind, had Jesus Christ, God's own Son, to thank for bringing us out of sin, for bearing our sins, and dying on the cross for us. So bowing down to show our gratitude for these, and many more things, in our day-to-day lives, shows an attitude of thankfulness and gratitude, something that remains even in secular American holidays, such as Thanksgiving. And thirdly, holding our hands in prayer, as though we're being shackled, may well be a sign that we remember what it was like to be shackled to sin and our iniquities. Also important to remember, as mentioned above, the Jews were enslaved by the Egyptians, and thus most likely would have prayed in just such situations. In short, this isn't religion to keep people enslaved, but to give hope to those who are enslaved. But their chains may be broken by the blood of the Lamb, and they may be set free. So, starting to sum it up, despite what many naysayers would say about the biblical position on slavery, it seems they fall into the classical traps of missing context, both textual and historical, backwards thinking on the position of the slaves being beaten, and only looking at things that they want to present for their arguments. Whilst there's no denying those passages are in there, and they have been used by Christians in the past to justify the ownership and trading of slaves. When things look positive in terms of one's comfort, prosperity, or merely bolstering one's own prejudice, it's not hard to focus on the verses that give you the righteous feeling and allow them to justify ownership of another human. One might say our focus is dictated by societal norms, and unfortunately that is true. But when Jeremiah is taken into account, you can see that God hates the idea of us claiming we are better than our fellow humans and think we have a right to buy and sell them, even when he says himself, let them go. Paul was concerned for the slaves as a whole and looked to keep them safe until the powers that kept them enslaved were weak enough that a revolt would be possible with the minimum of casualties. If that's not caring for people, then I don't know what is. The Bible does not endorse slavery, but tells us that we should be good and gracious employers who should give our workers reasons to remain, not for fear of death, not for fear of losing your family, but because they genuinely love their job and their working conditions. In today's world of people leaving jobs for the tiniest slights, it's worth remembering why Paul told the slaves to wait. Because trying to bring it down now, or trying to leave now, would only result in people getting hurt more than if you waited until more people can leave safely. It's like waiting for the economy to regrow before you move on to a job that will pay you better. Even in our worship practices, which may seem subservient and sycophantic, it teaches us humility and reminds us that as humans we are not better than anyone else, no matter what we might think. Naysayers may continue to bash the Bible for having slavery laws, but since the ones I'm generally arguing against are based in an area notorious for its bigoted fundamentalist Christian population, straw manning is going to occur, and that leads us nowhere. Ultimately, when you look into the laws surrounding one of the oldest institutions in the world, it is clear that unless you're determined to make the lawgiver look bad, the negative aspects are not applicable to the people as a whole. We will do very well to remember that we are all God's servants, and so can't use that as a method of lording over anyone else. Kings, queens, and aristocrats aren't between us and God, but merely people who have power to provide more for us, if they choose to do so or not. I'd hardly recommend looking at the actual history and life of aristocrats and how kings and queens should operate, or even how they can operate. So no matter who you are, where you are, or what station you're at, stay humble, stay safe, and God be with you.